All right, New Testament readers, week 48 has come. 48, 49, 50, 51, 52. With this week, at the beginning of this week, there's just 5 to go. It is the home stretch. We're 90% of the way there. All right, we're going to continue in 1 Peter and finish that book this week. Continue to observe how Peter applies Jesus' suffering faithfully as an example of our suffering. And notice as well how he emphasizes in chapters 3 and 4 how what Christ has done looks clear back to the beginning of the human story. It reaches back to bring salvation to the faithful, but also condemnation to those who have been God's enemies. And then when we get to chapter 5, I want to draw special attention to what this letter says at the beginning of chapter 5, because it's addressed directly to those who are leaders in the church, who are called episkopoi, or overseers. They would be, it's a word that's equivalent, though a different word is used elsewhere that we translate as elder. These were the collective leaders of the early churches. And notice how in particular it says, once again, we follow the example of Christ as we lead the church, because Christ is the great shepherd of the sheep. You should shepherd the flock as Christ does, he says. All right, so 2 Peter, though, is going to have a very different tone and style than 1 Peter. A lot of people wonder why that is. I think it's because Silvanus or Silas was involved in writing 1 Peter along with Peter, and so he affected the style. He was an associate of Paul as well as of Peter, according to 1 Peter chapter 5. But 2 Peter is in a different situation too. We often call this a testamentary letter, meaning it's a letter written by someone who is saying farewell at the end of life and reflecting on that. So how does Peter reflect here? Well, first of all, by telling the church to keep growing, keep maturing in the way they live out the gospel. To remember that the gospel is not a bunch of made-up stuff, that he and others were witnesses of Jesus, saw him transfigured, and so understand him to be the Christ. The second chapter of 2 Peter is nearly, I shouldn't say identical, it's very, very similar to the letter of Jude. It appears that both of them were addressing, using the same words, whether they borrowed one from the other or they borrowed from another source that we don't have, we don't know, but they're addressing the same kind of problem, which is false teachers who are claiming to be so super spiritual, so far above other people, that whatever they do in the body doesn't matter. They can live as selfishly, as greedily, as licentiously as they want, and it doesn't affect their situation. Well, 2 Peter treats this as just the grandest of lies, as does Jude, which we'll be reading later. Then the third chapter of 2 Peter is going to remind us that we need to be patient, waiting for Jesus to return. Peter says a lot of folks are saying, hey, where is that Lord you said was coming back? It's been forever. Well, let's remember it had been a generation at that time, but that felt like forever. And so he says, a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years. But by his power we await a new heaven and earth where righteousness dwells. It's a marvelous promise that we get at the end of this book. We will just get a toehold on 1 John at the end of the week. 1 John is written to a group of Christians who are dealing with a kind of false teaching that may be rather like what we see in 2 Peter. People who were claiming a kind of super spirituality, which meant they weren't sinners, they couldn't commit sin, and they looked down on other people in a condescending kind of a way while just living with rampant sinfulness. So it's going to emphasize at the beginning what 2 Peter does at its beginning. The gospel is true. We saw this stuff. And then it will go on to say, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. But if we confess our sins, God is faithful to forgive them. Admitting that you're a sinner and that you remain weak and frail and subject to sin, and you do sin, man, that's where it's at with the God of mercy who sent Jesus to die for our sins. Now you notice the general letters show us especially how the church was struggling with suffering and persecution and with false teaching. Little wonder, right? The gospel always turns our view of the world upside down and puts us in a situation where we're going against the current, but towards the truth and towards God's blessing. So Think about that as you're reading this week as we're coming to the back of the New Testament.